Hello and welcome to this new episode of the FinTech Scotland podcast. Today we're going to look at the future of the payment landscape. I think it's fair to say that it's going through a major transformation just now. PSD3 has changed the status quo and we're still seeing new innovation coming through thanks to this regulatory change. So today we'll look beyond PSD2 and explore the anticipated arrival of PSD3. Still early days and we don't know quite yet what it's going to look like. And therefore there's still quite a lot of questions that need to be answered. What does it mean for fintech businesses, for banks, for merchants, for consumers, which is probably the most important things. So in this episode, we'll explore the upcoming regulatory shift, the opportunities and the challenges they present, and what the future of payment might look like. So to discuss this, I've invited a great guest today, Ann Zheng, associate at Pinsent Masons, one of our strategy partners. Lovely to see you, and thank you for joining us today.
No, thank you for having me. So I'm an associate at Pinsent Masons in the financial services regulatory team, and I specialize in all things payments, so including digital assets, financial crime, and consumer credit regulation.
Fabulous. Well, it's great to have you. Thank you for coming today. And I guess to start with, because not everyone will know what PSD3 is, would you mind giving us a quick overview as to your definition of PSD3?
Sure. So PSD3, or the Payment Services Directive, is obviously, I guess, the next installment in sort of the trilogy of the payment service directives. We've seen PSD2 roll out, I guess, new payment services within Europe and also in the UK as well, sort of mirroring closely to what PSD is doing. But under PSD3 is sort of establishing more frameworks to how certain services are offered in open banking. It was sort of a precursor to open finance, with cross-border payments in the sort of establishing the licensing framework for payment institutions and e-money institutions, and also strengthening those consumer protections that we're already seeing under PSD2. PSD3, I guess, sort of branches out into directives and regulation with the establishment of the payment services regulations. And the idea is sort of a split system where the licensing and the authorization type requirements will fall under the directives, and then the more sort of conduct requirements for payment firms and banks will fall under the regulations. And this will mean, I guess, a revamp of current firms that are licensed, and also for those that are sort of currently sitting outside of the regulatory perimeter, such as technical service providers, will need to sort of look more carefully at their operations to ensure that they remain outside the perimeter.
Great, thank you for that. And you've mentioned regulation a few times in your answer. Some argue sometimes that regulation stifles innovation. Others will say that it's the opposite. And certainly our view at FinTech Scotland is regulation is an enabler. And we've seen that with PSD2, with a lot more competition, a lot more innovation coming through. What's your view, and what are you seeing at Pinsent Masons in terms of the companies you work with?
Yeah, sure. So as a regulatory lawyer, I'm probably biased in this respect. I see regulation quite helpful in establishing sort of a framework for innovation and how things can operate within or outside of the perimeter. Interestingly, I think clients are sort of increasingly more interested in having more detailed and more prescriptive guidance from regulators to ensure that they can know exactly what's going ahead and what their expectations are for their operations. So if we look at, I guess, open banking as a kind of a case study, pre-PSD2, open banking providers still existed. They just operated within an unregulated environment mostly. But with the introduction of new payment services with open banking targeted under PSD2, such as the payment initiation service and the account servicing sort of information service providers, I think what we see is that instead of stifling innovation in that space, PSD2 helpfully established data access for open banking providers, which enabled them to access account payment data in a sort of regulated and frameworked environment, which I think is more helpful because it sort of created that expectations for banks to share their data. And similarly with PSD3 is sort of strengthening the work that has already been done by PSD2 framework, sort of strengthening those API requirements, making sure that performance and functionalities of APIs are operating as they should, and also including things like needing consumers to be able to access a dashboard to be able to sort of tick on and tick off their consents for third-party providers. So I think all these things sort of provide a helpful guideline in order for all these players to slot into the payment chain more effectively. And sort of on this theme, PSD3 also has the concept of, I guess, de-risking, which is sort of evening the playing field between banks and non-bank providers with things like access to payment schemes, and also making sure that banks that are providing safeguarding accounts and commercial bank accounts to payment institutions and e-money institutions aren't able to sort of to refuse their services. They're sort of encouraged to give actual reasons and sort of target those set parameters in which they can refuse service. So I think all these things help in making sure that players are able to access the payments infrastructure in a sort of a more evenly spaced out way, which helpfully, I think, is able to support innovation rather than stifle it. Because, more people in the scheme, you're able to, I guess, become a less fragmented environment for payment players to operate in. I think on the flip side, I do query some of the proposals in PSD3, in particular to unregulated entities such as technical service providers. They sort of foreshadow that they need to look at that space more carefully. So currently, technical service providers like payment gateways and data processors don't really sit within the regulatory perimeter because they don't handle payment flow, just data flow. There is a understanding that these players are becoming increasingly integrated in the payment infrastructure. And therefore, I guess the regulators don't like the fact that they're sitting completely outside of the supervisory scope. But I guess in terms of bringing them in, it's unclear what the rationale is, because sort of the Commission does admit there is not much consumer harm being done by these players who don't really interact direct with end consumers. So there is a question there for whether, when sort of regulation tips over to over-regulation, which inadvertently would bring unintended players within the scope of regulation, which might cause friction within the chain, which will ultimately be passed down to end consumers.
Do you think that could be because they want to ensure resilience throughout the supply chain, almost a bit like DORA does at the European level?
Yeah, I'm sure that the reason that they're looking at this more carefully is because they've become more critical in the payments chain, and inadvertently they don't want for particular failures and inefficiencies within one parts of the chain to have a flow-on effect to the others who are regulated. So it makes sense, I think, in terms of conceptually looking at all the players and making sure that the whole spectrum of the chain works together rather than individually regulated. But yeah, it does cause questions as to how efficient this model will be once potentially technical service providers are included in some form of, I think they flagged a potential EU licensing model for technical service providers that they might examine within 3 years of PSD3. So it'll be a watch this space type of.
It's potentially a lot of work for you, but I'm interested in, which is good. I'm interested, but you mentioned open banking. And PSD2 being very much the enabler, although open banking started before PSD2. But do you see PSD3 as being a road to open finance, where it's not just about banking, but we're starting to look at cross-border, we're starting to look at all the other kind of transaction that one company might need to develop new innovation?
Yeah, I think open banking is an interesting one because I think the adoption for open banking has been a bit slower than anticipated. So I'm not sure in terms of the EU statistics, but I think in the UK, most recently, it was said to be 1 in 7 customers use open banking services. And I think PSD2, whilst it rolled out open banking data interfaces requirements, I think the issues there were that there was obstacles with like the lack of consistency with how these interfaces are available and the performance and the functionalities of the interfaces. So I think these types of issues within the open banking have sort of caused consumers to resist adopting it at the sort of the pace that was anticipated. I think in terms of how PSD will impact open banking, it seeks to try and remove some of those obstacles by sort of strengthening API rules and introducing consumer access to dashboards and such things, which will have I think a positive impact on open finance as well. Because I think the use cases for between open banking and open finance are there are sort of learned things that can be used across both models. And I think that it's anticipated that the account servicing sort of infrastructure or the access to such payment data would be seen as a building block for open finance, which obviously builds on not just payments data, but other types of financial data. Sort of the gateway to that would be very similar to how banks currently share with open banking open banking service providers. So I think there are similarities that can be used here, but I think right now we're still sort of very much trying to figure out what the issue is with open banking and why adoption hasn't been as successful as intended. And hopefully PSD3 will help strengthen that.
Yeah. And, one thing that has really developed very quickly is embedded payments. There's been a lot of innovation in that space, and in many ways, PSD3 could be an enabler to take that even further. Is that how you view this, like the development of embedded finance, of super apps also, where everything's in one place and creating better engagement for consumer, better ways to manage their finances and pay? Your view as well?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things within PSD3 that we've already sort of touched upon, like open banking and strong customer authentication changes that might help in sort of limiting or smoothing out the currently fragmented payments landscape. I think if we look at super apps in other jurisdictions, particularly in Asia, such as WeChat and Alipay, that sort of combine multiple user experiences into the one platform, like shopping, messaging, and bill payments and money remittance and so forth. I think these apps kind of rely on a couple of things, but most importantly, the payments integration piece is very important. I think PSD3 will help with that because it will I guess, open up the market for more, third-party payment providers to integrate with traditional forms of banks and other fairly established payment firms in order to produce this kind of like new embedded services within financial services platforms and other types of platforms. But I think whether it sort of supports the rise of super apps, I think it's an open question because I think I'm not sure that the regulatory environment within Europe is cohesive enough to support the rise of a sort of a pan-European super app, yes. The same way that we've seen Asia. But yeah, I think PSD3 definitely helps support that journey rather than detracts from it.
And I guess that leaves the other question I had, you've probably just answered it, but when we look at inefficiencies right now in terms of cross-border transactions, I was about to ask you, do you think PSD3 is going to be a revolution in that space, or do you think, because we're so fragmented in Europe, it's not going to change?
Yeah, I think it's going to, again, help rather than detract from it. But I think that introduces some disclosure and reporting requirements for payments from EU countries and third countries. But in terms of, I guess, like a holistic European payment payment sort of solution, I don't think there is something that currently exists. In saying that, there's going to be increased transparency under PSD3. Users would sort of be told what the charges are, what the fees are likely to be, when settlement is likely to occur. Obviously, they can't mandate the settlement execution times with third countries because that's not under the jurisdiction. But there's sort of increased, I guess, notification requirements so that users are aware of what is going to happen. And I think all those things would support, cross-border transparency and cross-border payments, because that's one thing that potentially detracts people from using these services.
Okay. And you mentioned stronger authentication. PSD3, do you think it is solving the problem, the fraud problem, or do you think we need to go beyond PSD3? Is PSD3 enough just now, do you think?
Yeah. I feel like regulation's always playing catch up with fraud, just because these sort of fraud typologies evolve so quickly. So I guess if we look at the evolution of fraud tackling mechanisms from PSD2 to PSD3, I think PSD2 saw quite effectively strong customer authentication in reducing, I guess, unauthorized transactions and the likes of that. But then now you've got different types of fraud typologies like social engineering and impersonation and so forth. And PSD3 sort of quickly came up with a framework in order to tackle these new fraud trends, which obviously will have an impact in reducing fraud. Things like making sure that payee and IBAN numbers are verified, which I think a lot of the major payment firms are already doing. Having that mandatory regulatory sort of piece on firms educating consumers about different types of fraud. Again, that's something lots of firms are already doing, but now there's a regulatory requirement to do so. And interestingly, they've included, reimbursement requirements for victims of particular types of fraud, like impersonation fraud, where someone's impersonating as an employee of a bank or of a payment firm, and hence you authorize a transaction to a legitimate payee. I think the changes there are a symptom of the fact that there is a blurred line between unauthorized and authorized transactions now in the fraudscape, and we need to have efficient ways of dealing with that. But whether it's enough to stop fraud, my personal opinion is no, because as we see fraud typologies evolve over time in order to get around this type of sort of known trends, like they're constantly evolving as well. So I think it's fairly difficult to play catch up in such a fast moving system. But I think, with new types of, authorized fraud cases, there is now a framework to deal with that. And with the UK, we've had recently the introduction of the APP fraud reimbursement scheme, which is quite well known. That, again, similarly to PSD3, is trying to figure out how do we manage fraud typologies where people are authorizing payments to or consenting to particular payments to be made. So again, I think it's always a catch up, but I'm supportive always of more sort of fraud combating mechanisms in order to stop consumers being out of pocket. And I think PSD3 is establishing a good framework for that to happen.
Thank you. One thing we've not mentioned yet, but which is quite prevalent in the conversation around PSD3 is decentralized finance and crypto. Do you think that with PSD3, we're going to create more space for new digital currencies? Or do you still think that there's a long way from a regulatory perspective to be in a position where cryptocurrency will be democratized?
Yeah, I think maybe not so much PSD3, but definitely in parallel legislation, we've seen lots of developments in the crypto space with MiCA and also with, the upcoming UK crypto landscape. I think in terms of PSD3, there potentially are parallels that could be used in terms of, open banking and how the treatment of certain e-money providers. A lot of these, financial services regimes are quite similar. So what we would probably see is like the requirements for traditional forms of finance under PSD3 and the requirements for crypto firms and cryptocurrency issuers under sort of parallel legislation in respect of disclosures and respect of governance and licensing to be quite similar. So I think it probably wouldn't develop in a silo, but we would probably see some learnings across crypto legislation and PSD3 for more traditional forms of finance.
Okay. But look, just a couple of questions to finish up, but one would be around the pace of change. And I'm thinking, especially for established firm with legacy systems, lots of processes. I mean, in just the last few years, we've had GDPR, we had PSD2, there was the PSD3. That's a lot of changes being thrown at them. From your experience with your customers, your clients, do you think it's a bit too much? Do you think it's welcomed, or do you think it's becoming very costly and maybe forcing companies to focus on adhering to regulatory changes as opposed to using those changes to innovate?
Yeah, that's a good question. I guess it's always a balancing act. For clients, I guess the good news is that from what I've seen of PSD3 and the upcoming changes is that it's intended to build on, a framework very much already established by PSD2. It hasn't introduced, maybe outside of the new licensing regime and sort of the own funds calculations and the new customer-facing type requirements that you will need to be implemented into your terms, conditions, and operations. Outside of those things, I think largely is still reflective of the model that we've seen under PSD2. So it's more of an enhancing and strengthening rather than an overhaul of the existing regulatory framework. So on that front, I think in terms of the operational costs to firms in this space, I don't expect it to be a significant cost, basically. But in terms of, upcoming changes, obviously for currently unregulated entities who are very soon going to be caught within the regulatory perimeter. For, I guess, for the UK, that's the crypto firms and trading platforms and so forth. That would, like, that first thrust into the regulatory space would be a huge uplift, because you'll be uplift across your entire model in terms of your governance framework, your disclosures, and your terms and conditions and so forth. But for regulated entities who are already operating within PSD2 and then brought into PSD3 landscape, we don't think that will be a huge burden on top of what they're already doing.
And my last question will be about customers, the end consumer at the end. If you had to tell Joe Blogs in the street why PSD3 is a good thing for them, what would you say?
I guess I would concentrate on the consumer protections that PSD3 is trying to enhance, especially with what we've spoken about already in respect of fraud, in respect of strong customer authentication and open banking. So I think that piece is probably most relevant to retail consumers. And for me personally, obviously I am a payments customer as well. It's interesting to see, I guess, the different ways in which innovation can support in tackling fraud. So one thing I do really enjoy is the IBAN verification. I find it very helpful when I'm personally sending payments, and to also know that there is a backstop, not that firms and banks would always compensate and reimburse for all types of, not fraud, but all types of payment failures. But there is a comfort in knowing that we are moving in a direction where there is more protections for consumers.
Very good. Well, and thank you so much for your time today. It's been excellent. So much I've learned just listening to you. And I'm sure that will be the same for everyone who subscribed to this blog and this podcast. So thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
We'll have you again, if that's okay with you, in the future.
Yes.
When we know a bit more about PSD3, and we'll bring you back to see whether it's delivered.
Yep. Always completely different to how we envision.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Fabulous. Well, thank you very much. And
thank you so much.
For our listeners, we'll speak to you soon. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Yeah. Bye.